In the quiet underlayer of a forest, where soil looks still and roots seem to simply hold trees in place, something far busier is happening. Threads so fine they vanish into the dark, exchanges that never break the surface, signals that do not need sound, connections that do not need wires. Welcome to the Sleepy Scientist. If drifting through questions like this feels like a good way to unwind, you're very welcome to subscribe and join these quiet explorations. And if you feel like it, share where in the world you're listening from tonight. It is always comforting to know how far these thoughts travel. For a long time, forests were studied as if the important part was what could be seen. Trunks, canopies, leaves, light, the obvious architecture. But modern ecology has spent decades revealing a second forest beneath the first. A living interface where roots meet microbes, where fungi braid through soil, and where the boundaries between one tree and the next can become surprisingly blurred. Some of the most important partnerships down there involve mycorrhizal fungi, not the kind that make a dramatic entrance, but the kind that quietly build infrastructure. Filaments that spread outward, exploring tiny pores in the ground, reaching into spaces roots cannot fit. In return for sugars made in daylight, these fungi can help deliver water and nutrients collected in darkness. And as those fungal threads spread, they do not always stop at a single tree. Networks form, overlaps appear, links persist, not in the sense of a conscious plan, and not with the warmth of intention. Just a set of relationships strong enough to create structure and responsive enough to produce behavior that looks, from the surface, almost coordinated. Tonight's journey explores that hidden web, not as a fairy tale about trees whispering secrets, but as real biology and real system science. The kind of story where intelligence does not need a mind, and where organization can emerge without a leader. A forest that does not think, and yet behaves as if it is paying attention. If this sounds unsettling, it does not need to be. It can also be steadying. Because beneath all that leaf and light, the forest is not simply standing there. It is interacting, it is adjusting, it is responding. Settle in. Let the canopy fade a little, and let the underground come into focus slowly. Stand in a forest for a moment and everything seems calm. Trees rise where they have always risen. Leaves move only when the air asks them to. Nothing rushes, nothing appears to decide. And yet, beneath that stillness, the forest is doing far more than simply existing. Across seasons, forests adjust. They survive droughts that last years. They recover from fires that strip hillsides bare. They respond to insect outbreaks, storms, and shifting climates with a kind of persistence that feels almost deliberate. When resources grow scarce in one place, growth slows. When conditions improve, life returns, often faster than expected. From the outside, this can look uncannily coordinated, as if the forest is acting with purpose. What makes this striking is what forests lack. There is no brain hidden beneath the soil. No central controller issuing instructions, no nerves carrying commands from one part to another. Each tree stands rooted, unable to move, unable to think, unable to know anything at all in the way humans understand knowing. And yet the forest as a whole behaves in ways that seem organized, adaptive, and strangely effective. In science, the word behavior does not mean intention. It does not imply awareness, choice, or planning. Behavior simply describes how a system responds when conditions change. A thermostat has behavior. A river has behavior. Even a crystal growing in solution follows behavioral rules, responding predictably to temperature and concentration. In living systems, behavior often emerges from chemistry, structure, and feedback, not from thought. When scientists describe forest behavior, they are talking about patterns. Growth accelerating here and slowing there. Resources being taken up, stored, released, or redirected. damage triggering responses that reduce further harm. None of this requires a mind. It only requires mechanisms that respond reliably to the world around them. This is where intuition often gets in the way. Human experience trains the mind to associate coordination with control. When something complex works smoothly, there is usually a planner behind it. When parts act together, someone must be telling them how. That assumption works well for machines and societies. It works badly for nature. Biology is full of systems that achieve order without oversight. Ant colonies build nests, manage traffic, and allocate labor without any ant understanding the colony as a whole. Immune systems identify threats, remember past infections, and adjust future responses without a single cell knowing the body it protects. In each case, local interactions, repeated millions of times, generate outcomes that look far more intelligent than any individual part. Forests belong in this category. What appears to be collective behavior arises from countless small responses happening simultaneously. Roots grow toward moisture, leaves adjust to light, microorganisms process nutrients. Fungi extend their reach through soil. None of these actions are remarkable on their own. Together, repeated across thousands of organisms and decades of time, they create something that looks coordinated from a distance. This phenomenon has a name. Emergent behavior describes situations where complex patterns arise from simple rules without any central direction. The individual components follow local conditions. The system, taken as a whole, displays order. Traffic jams form without accidents. Flocks of birds turn as one without a leader. Markets rise and fall without anyone controlling the outcome. In each case, the intelligence is not located anywhere. It emerges from interaction. Forests are shaped by this same logic. A tree does not know it is part of a forest. It responds to light, water, nutrients, temperature, and chemical signals in its immediate surroundings. Multiply that response by millions of trees, billions of roots, and trillions of microorganisms, and patterns appear that no single organism could produce alone. Seeing the forest as a system rather than a collection of individuals changes the question entirely. The mystery is no longer how trees think, but how structure and interaction generate behavior that works. How stability can arise from constant change. How adaptation can happen without foresight. This perspective also removes the need for romantic explanations. There is no requirement to imagine trees caring for one another or making decisions for the greater good. Natural selection does not reward kindness. It rewards outcomes that persist. Systems that distribute resources efficiently, recover from damage and maintain balance tend to last longer. Over long spans of time, those systems become common, not because they are moral, but because they are stable. Researchers studying forests have measured this stability in practical ways. Forests with intact underground systems recover more quickly after disturbance. Nutrient cycles become smoother. Growth patterns become more even. When those systems are disrupted, recovery slows and vulnerability increases. These observations do not require belief in forest intelligence. They only require acceptance that interaction matters. What makes this unsettling and also quietly fascinating is how far this challenges everyday ideas about intelligence. If a system can behave intelligently without thinking, then intelligence may not be a thing an organism possesses. It may be something a system does. That idea can feel uncomfortable at first. It loosens the boundary between life and mechanism, between intention and outcome. But it also offers a calmer view of nature, one where order does not need command and complexity does not need awareness. The forest does not plan for the future. It does not know it is resilient. It does not understand drought or recovery. And yet, through layers of interaction built up over evolutionary time, it responds as if it does. Not because it is clever, but because the rules it follows happen to work. Once that shift settles in, the forest stops looking mysterious in a frustrating way and starts looking mysterious in a productive one. The question is no longer whether the forest thinks. It is how so much organisation can arise without thinking at all. That question does not diminish the forest, it deepens it. Intelligence is a word that carries a lot of baggage. It usually brings to mind planning, reasoning, memory and awareness. It sounds like something that belongs inside a head, preferably a human one. But in science, intelligence has never been limited to conscious thought. In fact, many of the most effective forms of intelligence operate without anything resembling a mind. In biology, intelligence is often defined in terms of function rather than feeling. Can a system adjust when conditions change? Can it solve problems posed by its environment? Can it store information in some form and use that information later? Can it maintain stability while constantly being pushed off balance? These are not philosophical questions. They are practical ones, asked by researchers studying everything from bacteria to ecosystems. A single bacterium has no awareness. It does not know where it is or what it is doing, and yet it can detect chemical gradients, move toward nutrients, avoid toxins, and alter its behavior based on past exposure. The bacterium does not think its way through these decisions. Its molecular machinery responds to signals. Proteins bind, reactions shift, behavior changes. Intelligence in this context is not about insight, it is about effective response. The same logic applies at larger scales. In systems science, intelligence is often discussed as information processing. A system receives inputs, transforms them according to internal rules, and produces outputs that affect its future state. The system does not need to understand those rules, it only needs to follow them consistently. This is where the idea of distributed intelligence becomes useful. In a distributed system, no single component has an overview of what is happening. There is no control room, no master plan. Each part responds locally, and yet the system as a whole can display behavior that looks purposeful when viewed from a distance. Weather systems are a classic example. No cloud decides to form a storm. No air parcel knows it is part of a hurricane. Local interactions between temperature, pressure, and moisture generate patterns that organize themselves. The storm moves, strengthens, weakens, and dissipates, all without awareness or intention. Intelligence is not present anywhere in particular, but organization clearly is. Biological systems take this even further. Cells communicate through chemical signals. Tissues coordinate through gradients and feedback. Organisms adapt over generations through natural selection, a process that has no foresight but produces structures that appear finely tuned. The appearance of design emerges from repeated filtering, not from planning. Some scientists have spent decades studying how this kind of order arises. Stuart Kaufman, for example, has explored how complex systems can spontaneously organize themselves under the right conditions. His work shows that when many components interact under simple rules, patterns often emerge that are neither random nor imposed from above. They are a natural consequence of interaction. This kind of self-organization challenges the intuition that intelligence must be deliberate. In self-organizing systems, behavior is shaped by feedback. Certain patterns reinforce themselves because they are stable. Others fade because they are not. Over time, the system settles into configurations that work, not because they are chosen, but because alternatives fail to persist. It is important to be clear about what this does not mean. Intelligence without minds does not imply hidden consciousness. It does not suggest that systems secretly know more than they let on. It simply recognizes that effective behavior can arise without awareness. A calculator performs complex operations without understanding mathematics. A beehive regulates temperature without any bee knowing the target value. An ecosystem maintains balance without intending to. One reason this idea feels uncomfortable is that human intelligence is so closely tied to experience. Thoughts feel central. Decisions feel personal. It is tempting to assume that anything intelligent must share that inequality. But biology repeatedly shows that effectiveness does not require experience. It requires structure. In fact, consciousness appears to be a relatively late and specialized development. Life existed for billions of years before anything resembling awareness appeared. During that time, organisms still adapted, competed, cooperated, and reshaped the planet. Intelligence, if defined as successful interaction with the environment, long predates thought. This broader definition also helps explain why intelligence comes in degrees rather than categories. A thermostat is minimally intelligent. A bacterium is more so. An ant colony more still. None of these systems suddenly cross a threshold where intelligence switches on. They simply accumulate mechanisms that allow more flexible responses. What matters is not whether a system thinks, but whether it can respond in ways that improve its chances of persistence. Can it detect change? Can it adjust? Can it stabilize? Can it recover? These questions apply just as well to forests as they do to organisms. Seeing intelligence this way strips it of mystique without stripping it of significance. It becomes something grounded and observable, something that can be measured in response times, recovery rates, and adaptability. Something that can be studied without speculation about inner states. There is also a quiet humility in this perspective. It suggests that intelligence is not a rare gift handed out sparingly to certain creatures. It is a natural property of organized systems under the right conditions. When interactions become dense enough, feedback becomes strong enough, and constraints shape behavior over time, intelligence appears. This does not diminish human thought. It places it within a continuum. Human intelligence becomes one expression of a broader phenomenon rather than an exception to it. Minds do not stand apart from nature, they emerge from it. Once this idea settles in, the question of forests behaving intelligently becomes less surprising. If intelligence does not require a mind, then the absence of brains is no longer an obstacle. The relevant question shifts. Not whether forests think, but whether their structure allows them to process information and adapt. That shift matters. It changes what is worth paying attention to. Instead of searching for intention, attention turns to interaction. Instead of asking what a system wants, the focus becomes what it does when conditions change. With that lens in place, the forest no longer looks like a puzzle waiting for consciousness to be discovered. It looks like a system waiting to be understood. For much of modern science, forests were studied from the ground up only in the most literal sense. What mattered was what could be seen. Trunks could be measured, leaves could be counted, canopies could be mapped from above. Light, height, growth rate, and timber yield were tangible, accessible, and cooperative. The forest, as a scientific object, appeared to live almost entirely in the air. This focus was not driven by ignorance or lack of imagination. It was driven by practicality. Above ground, forests offer clear boundaries and stable reference points. A tree trunk stays where it is. A leaf can be weighed, photographed, and classified. A canopy can be surveyed year after year. Below ground, everything becomes more complicated very quickly. Soil is opaque. Roots tangle and overlap. Microorganisms are invisible without specialized tools. Digging disturbs the very structures being studied. Even today, studying underground systems often means destroying them in the process. For much of scientific history, this made the subterranean forest a frustrating and unreliable subject. Early forestry developed alongside industries that valued wood, fuel and land management. The questions being asked shaped what was studied. How fast do trees grow? How much timber can a forest produce? How does spacing affect yield? These questions naturally drew attention upward. Roots were assumed to be simple supports. Soil was treated as a passive medium. Whatever happened underground was considered secondary. This bias was reinforced by the limits of available technology. Before modern microscopy, molecular analysis, and imaging techniques, soil life was difficult to observe in any meaningful way. Microorganisms were present in staggering numbers, but counting them was nearly impossible. Chemical exchanges between roots and microbes occurred at scales far too small to track. Networks that spanned meters underground left no obvious trace at the surface. As a result, the underground world was often treated as a black box. Nutrients went in. Growth came out. The details in between were assumed to be straightforward, or at least unimportant. That assumption began to crack in the early 20th century. In 1908, a German agronomist named Lorenz Hiltner introduced a term that quietly shifted perspective. He described the rhizosphere as the narrow region of soil directly influenced by plant roots. Rather than viewing soil as uniform and inert, Hiltner proposed that roots actively shape their immediate environment, altering chemistry, microbial populations, and nutrient availability. This was a subtle but profound change. The rhizosphere suggested that roots were not passive recipients of soil conditions. They were participants. They released compounds. They attracted certain microbes. They created gradients and niches. Soil near roots behaved differently from soil just a short distance away. At first, this idea attracted limited attention. The tools needed to explore it properly were still lacking. But as microbiology advanced, the picture became harder to ignore. Researchers began to find that a single gram of healthy soil could contain billions of microorganisms representing thousands of species. Far from being lifeless dirt, soil was one of the most biologically dense environments on the planet. Soil ecologists started uncovering complex food webs beneath the forest floor, bacteria feeding on root exudates, fungi forming partnerships with plants, protozoa grazing on microbes, nematodes regulating populations, nutrients cycling through multiple organisms before ever reaching a tree root. The underground forest was not simple. It was crowded, dynamic, and busy. Even so, connecting this complexity to forest-scale behavior took time. It is one thing to know microbes exist. It is another to understand how their interactions scale up to influence drought resistance, growth patterns, or recovery after disturbance. That kind of connection requires long-term studies, careful measurement, and a willingness to think in systems rather than parts. Institutions such as the United States Forest Service began supporting long-running ecological research sites, where forests could be observed over decades rather than seasons. These studies revealed something important. Forests with intact soil communities behaved differently from those where soil had been heavily disturbed. Nutrient cycles were smoother. Recovery from stress was faster. Growth was more stable over time. Still, the underground remained difficult to visualize. Unlike canopies, which can be photographed from satellites, soil networks resist neat representation. What is gained in detail is often lost in clarity. Data arrives fragmented. Samples vary wildly from place to place. Patterns emerge only after careful aggregation and patient analysis. There is also a psychological factor at play. Humans are visual creatures. What cannot be seen is often undervalued. A towering tree feels significant. A thread-like fungus does not. It takes deliberate effort to appreciate that the latter may be doing more work than the former. Gentle humour sometimes appears in soil science for this reason. Researchers joke that the most important part of a forest is the part nobody notices. It is funny because it is true. The underground forest does not advertise itself. It does not impress at a glance. It quietly carries out the processes that make everything above possible. As evidence accumulated, the old picture of soil as a passive substrate became increasingly untenable. Roots were not simply drawing nutrients from a static reservoir. They were interacting with a living system. Microbes were not background noise. They were active agents shaping availability, flow, and feedback. This shift in understanding reframes earlier ignorance in a more charitable light. Scientists did not ignore underground systems because they were trivial. They ignored them because they were hard. The absence of detailed knowledge was not evidence of simplicity. It was evidence of limitation. Once that limitation is acknowledged, the story changes. The underground becomes not an afterthought, but a central player. The place where information is exchanged, resources are negotiated, and relationships are maintained. The forest begins to look less like a collection of trunks sharing space, and more like a layered system, with much of its coordination happening out of sight. Looking beneath the forest floor does not reveal a hidden brain or a secret command center. It reveals something more interesting, a dense web of interactions, each modest on its own, collectively shaping how the forest behaves. The question then is no longer why scientists failed to see it sooner. The question becomes how much of the forest's apparent intelligence depends on what was happening underground all along. Roots are easy to underestimate. They're hidden, quiet, and rarely admired. When thought of at all, they're often imagined as simple anchors or drinking straws, holding a tree upright and pulling water from the soil. That picture is tidy and almost entirely wrong. A root system is not passive. It is constantly sampling its surroundings, responding to subtle changes, and adjusting its growth accordingly. In biological terms, roots are information-rich interfaces. They sit at the boundary between the plant and its environment, absorbing far more than water and minerals. They gather data. One of the most basic signals roots respond to is moisture. Soil is never uniformly wet. Even after rainfall, water distributes unevenly, collecting in pores, clinging to particles, and draining along tiny channels. Roots can detect these gradients. When one part of a root system encounters slightly higher moisture than another, growth patterns shift. Cells elongate more on one side than the other. The root bends, slowly but decisively toward the wetter region. This behavior is known as hydrotropism. It does not involve choice or deliberation. At the cellular level, changes in water availability alter pressure and chemical balance. Those changes influence how cells expand. Over time, the cumulative effect is directional growth. The root follows the signal without knowing it is doing so. Nutrients create similar patterns. Essential elements such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are unevenly distributed through soil. Roots detect differences in concentration through chemical receptors embedded in their cell membranes. When nutrients are scarce, roots branch more aggressively, increasing surface area. When nutrients are abundant in a particular zone, growth becomes concentrated there. Experiments have demonstrated this with striking clarity. When researchers place barriers in soil that allow chemicals to pass but block physical contact, roots still grow toward nutrient sources. When nutrients are removed, growth slows. When they are restored, growth resumes. The response is precise, repeatable, and finely tuned. Roots also respond to chemical signals released by other organisms. Soil is full of messages. Bacteria, fungi, and neighboring plants release compounds that signal presence, stress, or opportunity. Roots can detect these cues and adjust behavior accordingly. In some cases, they avoid zones where harmful microbes are active. In others, they grow toward beneficial partners. This sensitivity is mediated by plant hormones, chemical messengers that regulate growth and development. Auxins play a central role in directing root growth. When auxin concentrations become uneven across a root tip, cells elongate more on one side, causing curvature. Cytokinins influence branching, encouraging the formation of new root tips in favourable conditions. Together with other hormones, they form a regulatory network that translates environmental signals into physical change. What is remarkable is how fine-grained this system is. Root tips, just millimetres long, can distinguish between tiny differences in nutrient concentration. They can respond to obstacles, redirecting growth around stones or compacted soil. They can slow down, speed up, or change direction entirely based on local conditions. Some studies have even shown roots responding to sound vibrations associated with flowing water. In controlled experiments, roots grew towards speakers emitting low-frequency sounds, similar to those produced by water moving through soil. The mechanism is still debated, but the implication is clear. Roots are sensitive to more than just chemistry. They respond to physical cues as well. It is tempting to describe this as decision-making. Roots appear to choose paths, avoid hazards, and seek resources, but this language can mislead. There is no inner experience guiding these responses. No awareness of alternatives. What looks like choice is the outcome of many interacting processes governed by physics and chemistry. Sensing does not require consciousness. A smoke detector senses smoke. A thermostat senses temperature. Neither knows what it is detecting. Roots operate in much the same way, though with far greater complexity. Their sensors are molecular. Their responses are slow. Their logic is distributed across millions of cells rather than housed in a central processor. The absence of awareness does not make the behavior trivial. In fact, it makes it more impressive. Without a nervous system, roots integrate multiple signals at once. Moisture, nutrients, toxins, physical barriers, microbial activity, and hormonal feedback all influence growth simultaneously. The resulting pattern reflects the combined effect of these inputs. Over time, this leads to root architectures that appear well matched to their environment. In dry soils, root systems spread widely, maximizing access to scarce water. In nutrient-rich patches, they concentrate growth where returns are highest. In compacted soils, roots exploit cracks and pores, navigating complex physical landscapes without sight or foresight. This adaptability has been documented across many plant species. Agricultural scientists have studied crop roots to improve yields under drought conditions. Ecologists have examined tree roots in forests spanning multiple climates. The same principles appear again and again. Roots respond locally, structure emerges globally. It is also important to note that roots are not isolated units. Signals received in one part of the root system can influence growth elsewhere. Hormones produced at the root tip can travel upward into the plant, affecting shoot growth. Signals from leaves, responding to light or damage, can travel downward, altering root behavior. Information flows both ways. This internal communication further blurs the line between sensing and coordination. A root encountering rich nutrients may trigger increased leaf growth above ground, which in turn produces more sugars that support further root expansion. Feedback loops link perception to response across the entire organism. Still, none of this requires a mind. It requires only sensitivity, feedback, and time. The language of information gathering is useful here, not because roots understand information, but because they change behavior based on it. They register differences. They encode those differences in chemical gradients. They act on them. Gentle humour occasionally surfaces in plant biology discussions for this reason. Roots are sometimes described as knowing where to grow, even though everyone involved understands that they know nothing at all. The phrase is shorthand, not a claim. It captures effectiveness, not awareness. Recognizing roots as information gatherers shifts perspective. They're no longer background plumbing. They're active interfaces, constantly negotiating with a complex environment. They collect signals, integrate responses, and shape growth patterns that influence the entire plant. When this process is multiplied across thousands of trees in a forest, the implications become clearer. Each tree is sampling its local conditions. Each root system is responding to moisture, nutrients, and chemical cues. The forest as a whole becomes a mosaic of overlapping responses. The coordination observed at the forest level does not begin with communication between trees. It begins with roots doing what they have always done: sensing, responding, adjusting. Once that foundation is in place, interactions beyond individual trees become possible. Roots do not just interact with soil, they interact with life within it. And it is there, in those interactions, that the forest begins to take on its larger interconnected character. Beneath the forest floor, wrapped around roots and threaded through soil, lives a partner that most trees have never been without. It does not photosynthesize, it does not produce leaves or wood, and yet without it, forests as they exist today would be almost impossible. These partners are mycorrhizal fungi. The name sounds technical, but the relationship is simple. Fungi attach themselves to plant roots and exchange resources. The plant provides sugars made through photosynthesis. The fungus provides access to water and nutrients gathered from the soil. It is a trade that has been evolving for hundreds of millions of years, long before forests looked anything like they do now. In fact, some of the earliest plants to colonize land are thought to have relied on fungal partnerships to survive at all. Soil was thin, nutrients were patchy, roots were primitive. Fungi fill the gap, extending the reach of those early plants into the ground and making life on land possible. What began as necessity became infrastructure. The key to this partnership lies in fungal hyphae. These are microscopic filaments, far thinner than plant roots, capable of slipping through tiny pores in the soil that roots cannot access. Where a root might be millimeters thick, a hypha can be just a few micrometers across. That difference matters. It allows fungi to explore a vastly larger volume of soil than roots alone ever could. When a fungus associates with a tree, its hyphae spread outward in all directions, forming a dense mesh. From the tree's perspective, it is as if its root system has suddenly grown many times larger. Nutrients such as phosphorus, nitrogen, and trace minerals are absorbed by the fungal network and delivered back to the plant. Water too can be transported along these threads, buffering trees against dry conditions. The scale of this extension is not trivial. Studies have shown that fungal hyphae can increase the effective absorptive surface area of a root system by orders of magnitude. This does not mean 10% more reach. It can mean 10 times more, sometimes far beyond that. The forest's true interface with the soil is not the roots alone, but the combined root and fungal network. There are different types of mycorrhizal fungi, forming distinct kinds of partnerships. Some wrap around roots, forming sheaths. Others penetrate root cells, creating intricate exchange structures. Each type has its own strengths, suited to different environments and plant species. Forests often contain multiple mycorrhizal strategies operating side by side. What makes this system especially interesting is that fungal networks do not necessarily respect the boundaries humans expect. A single fungal individual can connect to multiple trees, sometimes many of them, sometimes across different species. The fungus is not loyal to one partner. It responds to availability, demand, and compatibility. This possibility raised eyebrows when it was first seriously proposed. For decades, the assumption was that each tree had its own fungal associates, largely separate from its neighbours. But as researchers began tracing fungal networks using genetic markers and isotope labelling, a more connected picture emerged. One of the scientists who helped bring this idea into public view is Susan Simard, a forest ecologist whose work explored how trees connected through shared mycorrhizal networks. Her research showed that carbon could move through these fungal pathways from one tree to another, particularly between larger, established trees and younger seedlings. These findings did not suggest that trees were deliberately helping one another. Instead, they revealed that fungal networks create physical connections through which resources can flow. When one part of the network has excess and another has demand, movement can occur. The fungus mediates the exchange, responding to chemical gradients and metabolic signals. This kind of connection reshapes how the forest is understood. Trees are no longer isolated competitors sharing space. They are nodes in a web, linked by organisms that exist mostly out of sight. The forest floor becomes less like a battlefield of roots and more like a densely wired landscape. Importantly, these networks are not static. They grow, shrink, break, and reform. Disturbance alters them. New growth creates new links. Old connections decay. The fungal web is constantly being rebuilt, responding to changes above and below ground. Gentle humour sometimes appears in descriptions of these systems because the image is so unexpected. A forest that looks still and separate on the surface turns out to be threaded together underneath. It is not the kind of connection that can be seen in a photograph. It requires a shift in imagination. The fungal network also introduces a new kind of scale. Individual hyphae respond to local conditions, absorbing nutrients molecule by molecule. The network as a whole spans meters, sometimes kilometers. It links microscale chemistry to macroscale forest dynamics. This layering is what makes the system so powerful. It also complicates simple ideas of ownership. When nutrients move through a shared network, it becomes harder to say which tree they belong to. Resources do not always move in straight lines from soil to root to trunk. They circulate, pool, and redistribute depending on conditions. This circulation is not generous. It is efficient. Fungi allocate resources in ways that maximize their own survival. Trees that provide more sugars tend to receive more nutrients in return. Trees under stress may receive less. The network responds to incentives, not kindness. That distinction matters. It keeps the story grounded. There is no hidden morality beneath the forest floor. There is structure, feedback, and negotiation. The resulting behavior can look cooperative because cooperation in this context works. From a systems perspective, the fungal network functions as infrastructure. It is the physical medium that allows information and resources to travel beyond the limits of individual roots. Without it, each tree would be restricted to what it could directly reach. With it, the forest becomes integrated. This infrastructure does not tell the forest what to do. It does not issue commands or coordinate plans. It simply enables interaction. Once interaction is possible at sufficient scale, coordination can emerge naturally. Seeing the fungal network this way helps dissolve some of the mystery without removing the fascination. The forest is not communicating in whispers or making collective decisions. It is connected, and connection changes everything by extending reach, linking individuals, and allowing resources to move through shared pathways. Mycorrhizal fungi lay the groundwork for forest-wide behavior. They create the conditions under which local responses can influence distant outcomes. Once that physical network exists, the next question becomes unavoidable. If trees and fungi are connected, what actually moves along those connections? And that is where the story becomes even more concrete. Once fungal networks are in place, the forest gains something it did not have before: a way for resources to move beyond the limits of individual roots. What flows through these underground pathways is not mysterious energy or intention, but very ordinary substances, moved in quietly effective ways. At the center of this exchange is carbon. Trees capture carbon from the air through photosynthesis, using sunlight to turn carbon dioxide into sugars. These sugars are the primary currency of the forest. They power growth, repair, reproduction, and defense. A significant portion of the sugars a tree produces does not stay in the trunk or leaves. It is sent downward. Through roots, trees release sugars into the soil, where mycorrhizal fungi absorb them. In return, fungi deliver minerals that are difficult for roots to obtain on their own. Phosphorus is a key example. It binds tightly to soil particles and moves slowly through the ground. Fungal hyphae, with their vast surface area and fine reach, are far better at collecting it. Nitrogen and trace elements follow similar paths. This exchange is not symbolic, it is measurable. Forest ecologists have shown that trees can allocate a significant fraction of their photosynthetic output to fungal partners. In some systems, as much as 20% of the carbon fixed by a tree may pass through fungal networks. That is not a minor contribution, it is an investment. To understand where this carbon goes, scientists needed a way to track it. One of the most powerful tools for this has been isotope tracing. Carbon comes in different isotopic forms, chemically similar but distinguishable by mass. By supplying trees with carbon dioxide containing a rare isotope, researchers can follow that carbon as it moves through the forest. These experiments have produced striking results. Carbon introduced into the leaves of one tree can later be detected in fungal tissues connected to its roots. From there, it can appear in neighbouring trees, particularly those that share the same fungal partners. The carbon does not leap across the forest. It moves slowly, following physical pathways. Similar techniques have been used to trace nutrients moving in the opposite direction. Minerals absorbed by fungi can be detected within tree tissues hours or days later. The direction and magnitude of these flows depend on conditions. When a tree is shaded and produces less sugar, carbon tends to flow toward it. When a tree is well lit and growing rapidly, it becomes a source rather than a sink. This pattern has sometimes been described in emotional terms as trees helping one another. But the underlying mechanism is simpler and more reliable than generosity. Movement follows gradients. Where concentration is high, flow occurs toward areas of lower concentration. Where demand increases, uptake increases. The fungal network responds to these chemical differences automatically. Fungi themselves play an active role in regulating these exchanges. They are not passive conduits. They allocate resources toward partners that provide more carbon. Experiments have shown that fungi can reduce nutrient delivery to plants that supply fewer sugars, redirecting resources to more productive hosts. This behavior looks selective, but it does not require decision-making. It emerges from feedback between metabolic processes. The result is a system that distributes resources in a way that tends to stabilize the forest. Young seedlings growing in the shade of larger trees often receive carbon through shared networks, improving their chances of survival. Trees under stress may receive more support when conditions allow. During times of abundance, resources spread more widely. At the same time, the system is not egalitarian. Trees that consistently contribute little may be excluded over time. Fungi prioritize their own survival, and that means favoring exchanges that keep the network productive. Stability arises not from fairness, but from balance. This balance has measurable consequences. Forests with intact fungal networks show more even growth patterns across individuals. Nutrient availability fluctuates less dramatically. Recovery from disturbance is smoother. When networks are disrupted, resources become more unevenly distributed, and vulnerability increases. The movement of resources through fungal pathways also introduces time delays. Carbon fixed today may influence growth weeks or months later. Nutrients stored in fungal tissues can be released gradually. These delays dampen extremes, preventing sudden shortages or surpluses from destabilizing the system. From a systems perspective, this looks very much like a distribution network. Inputs enter at many points. Outputs emerge where needed. Flow adjusts dynamically based on local conditions. No part of the system needs to understand the whole. It simply responds to gradients and feedback. There is something quietly elegant about this. Instead of central planning, the forest relies on physics and chemistry. Instead of commands, it uses diffusion, transport, and metabolic exchange. The complexity arises not from complicated rules, but from many simple processes operating together. Gentle humor sometimes appears when scientists explain this, because the idea challenges expectations. It feels strange to say that a forest has a supply chain, yet the analogy works surprisingly well. Resources are produced, transported, allocated, and stored. Bottlenecks matter. Disruptions propagate. Efficiency affects resilience. What the forest does not have is intent. There is no decision to help a neighbor, no plan to prepare for winter. The apparent foresight comes from structure shaped by long evolutionary history. Systems that distributed resources effectively persisted. Those that did not faded. Understanding this helps clarify why forest behavior can appear intelligent without invoking thought. The network moves what is needed, where it is needed, when conditions allow. The outcome is adaptive, not because the forest knows what it is doing, but because the rules it follows work. As these exchanges continue day after day, year after year, they knit the forest into a coherent whole. Individual trees still live their own lives. They grow, compete, and die. But the flow of resources links their fates in subtle ways. Once resources can move through shared pathways, stability becomes possible at scales larger than any single organism. Disturbances in one area can be buffered by abundance in another. Stress does not remain isolated. It propagates, but so does support. This capacity for redistribution is one of the quiet foundations of forest resilience. It does not prevent loss. It does not guarantee survival, but it smooths extremes and buys time. In complex systems, time matters. By functioning as a distribution system rather than a collection of isolated pipelines, the underground network changes what a forest can be. It allows local responses to have wider effects. It allows the whole to be more than the sum of its parts. And once resources are moving this way, the next step is unavoidable. If distribution can stabilize the forest, then patterns of response begin to emerge. The forest starts to behave, not just react. That is where stability begins to take shape. Plants live in a world where danger rarely arrives suddenly. Drought builds slowly, insects arrive in waves, pathogens creep through tissue cell by cell. And because plants cannot run from any of it, their survival depends on early detection and rapid response. To do that, they rely on signaling. Not the electrical signals carried by nerves, but chemical ones, moving through air, soil, and living tissue. Every plant cell is surrounded by chemical information. Concentrations rise and fall. Molecules appear, disappear, and interact. To a plant, these changes matter. They indicate damage, scarcity, competition, or opportunity. When conditions shift, chemistry shifts with them, and plants respond. One of the most important triggers for signaling is stress. When a leaf is damaged by an insect, the cells at the wound site immediately begin to change their chemistry. Enzymes activate. Defensive compounds are produced. Hormones are released. These signals do not stay local, they travel. Inside the plant, chemical messengers move through vascular tissue, alerting distant leaves that something has gone wrong. Those leaves may thicken their cell walls, produce bitter compounds, or increase toxins that make them less palatable. This happens before the insect arrives. The plant does not wait to be eaten twice. Outside the plant, signals escape into the air. Volatile organic compounds are small molecules that evaporate easily and drift away from leaves. They carry information about what kind of stress the plant is experiencing. Different attackers produce different chemical signatures. A chewing insect triggers a different blend than a fungal infection or mechanical damage. These airborne signals do not linger for long, but while they are present, they matter. Neighbouring plants exposed to them often change their behaviour. Leaves may produce more defensive chemicals. Growth patterns may shift. Some plants even alter flowering time or resource allocation after exposure. This phenomenon has been demonstrated repeatedly in laboratory and field studies. When plants are exposed to air from damaged neighbours, they often suffer less damage when attacked later. The signal does not make them immune, it makes them prepared. From a human perspective, it is tempting to describe this as warning or communication. It sounds as though plants are alerting one another, but no message is being sent deliberately. The damaged plant releases chemicals as a consequence of its own internal response. Neighbours respond because their own chemistry is sensitive to those compounds. Coordination arises without intent. Roots participate in similar exchanges below ground. Plants release a wide range of chemicals into the soil, including sugars, amino acids, and signalling molecules. These root exudates influence microbial communities, attract beneficial partners, and sometimes inhibit competitors. Soil is not just a medium, it is a messaging space. When a plant experiences nutrient stress, the composition of its root exudates can change. This alters microbial activity nearby, which can in turn affect nutrient availability. In some cases, neighbouring plants respond to these changes as well, adjusting their own growth or chemistry. Chemical signalling also plays a role in recognising kin. Some studies suggest that plants can distinguish between roots from the same species and roots from different ones, altering competitive behaviour accordingly. The mechanism is chemical, not cognitive. Subtle differences in exudates and uptake patterns provide cues. One of the most striking aspects of plant signalling is how quickly it can act. Electrical signals do exist in plants, moving along membranes and vascular tissue, though much more slowly than in animal nerves. These electrical changes often trigger chemical cascades, amplifying the response. Within minutes of damage, distant parts of a plant may already be adjusting. At larger scales, chemical signalling helps coordinate responses across populations. During insect outbreaks, for example, forests often show widespread increases in defensive chemistry, even among trees that have not yet been attacked. Airborne signals combined with shared fungal networks spread information faster than physical damage alone ever could. Scientists studying these processes have documented specific compounds involved in signalling, such as jasminates and salicylates. These molecules regulate defense pathways and mediate trade-offs between growth and protection. Producing toxins costs energy. Signals help plants decide when that cost is worth paying. It is important to emphasize what is not happening here. Plants are not interpreting signals in any conscious sense. There is no understanding of meaning, no awareness of danger. Chemical receptors bind molecules. Binding triggers reactions. Reactions change behavior. That is the entire chain. This distinction matters because it keeps the explanation grounded. Once interpretation is removed, signalling becomes less mysterious and more impressive. Without brains, plants manage to integrate information from multiple sources and respond in context-appropriate ways. Gentle humour sometimes creeps into discussions of plant signalling because the behaviour feels so familiar. Leaves preparing for attack, roots negotiating with microbes, neighbours responding to unseen cues. It resembles communication, and yet it is entirely mechanical. The forest feels alive in a way that resists easy categories. Chemical signalling also introduces a second layer of coordination beyond resource movement. Resources answer the question of what is available. Signals answer the question of what is happening. Together, they allow the forest to respond not just to current conditions, but to impending ones. This capacity becomes especially important during large-scale stress. Drought, for example, affects entire regions. Chemical signals related to water stress can alter stomatal behavior, reduce transpiration, and shift growth patterns across many individuals. The response is not planned, but it is coherent. Researchers from institutions such as the Max Planck Institute for Chemical Ecology have spent years cataloguing the compounds involved in these interactions. Their work shows that plant signaling networks rival animal ones in complexity, even though the mechanisms differ entirely. Complexity does not require neurons, it requires interaction. Another important aspect of chemical signaling is its cost. Producing and releasing compounds consumes resources. Plants cannot afford to signal constantly. Signals are regulated, transient, and context-dependent. This ensures that responses remain proportional rather than overwhelming. This regulation introduces feedback. A plant that signals too aggressively may waste energy and grow poorly. One that signals too little may suffer damage. Over time, evolutionary pressure favours balanced responses. The signalling system becomes tuned. At the forest level, these individual tuning decisions accumulate. Signals spread unevenly, responses vary, yet patterns emerge. Increased defence here, reduced growth there, a shifting mosaic of behaviour that tracks environmental change. What results is not a conversation, but a flow of information. Chemistry carries state. It encodes stress, abundance, and threat. Plants that can read and respond to that state persist more effectively. Those that cannot fall behind. Seeing chemical signalling this way helps dissolve the final barrier to understanding forest coordination. Once information can move independently of physical resources, the system gains flexibility. It can anticipate, not just react. It can adjust before damage becomes widespread. None of this requires awareness. None of it requires understanding. And yet the outcome is adaptive behaviour at scales far larger than any individual plant. The forest does not know what is happening. It does not need to. Chemistry does the knowing. Interaction does the rest. When resource flow and information flow operate together, coordination becomes inevitable. Not because the forest intends it, but because the structure allows it. At that point, the idea of behaviour without brains no longer feels strange. It feels expected. When people first learn about underground networks and shared resources, a familiar story often takes shape. Trees helping one another, older trees supporting the young, a forest acting with generosity and care. It is an appealing image, and an understandable one. Human minds are very good at reading intention into patterns that look cooperative, but nature does not run on kindness. Forests do not cooperate because they want to. They cooperate because cooperation, under the right conditions, works. The difference may seem subtle, but it matters. It keeps the explanation grounded in biology rather than sentiment, and it allows the real complexity of forest behaviour to come into focus. In evolutionary terms, cooperation does not require compassion. It requires advantage. When an interaction increases the likelihood that the participants persist over time, that interaction tends to remain. When it does not, it fades. No moral judgment is involved. Outcomes are filtered by survival. not intention. This principle applies just as strongly to networks as it does to individuals. In a forest, trees that participate in effective underground exchanges tend to grow more reliably. They gain access to nutrients that would otherwise be unreachable. They buffer themselves against environmental swings. Over many generations, these advantages shape which strategies persist. The same logic applies to fungi. Mycorrhizal networks are not charitable organizations. They are businesses in the most basic sense. Fungi exchange nutrients for carbon. They allocate resources toward partners that provide a reliable return. When a tree contributes less, the fungus responds accordingly. Efficiency, not empathy, governs the exchange. This reciprocity is often described using the language of mutualism. Both partners benefit, but neither does so out of concern for the other. Each responds to incentives embedded in chemistry and metabolism. When the balance shifts, the relationship adjusts. Evolutionary biology offers many examples of this kind of cooperation without altruism. Cleaner fish remove parasites from larger fish, gaining food while providing a service. Neither party understands the arrangement. It persists because it works. Insects pollinate flowers while feeding on nectar. Again, benefit flows both ways without awareness or gratitude. Forests extend this logic to an extraordinary scale. Instead of two organisms interacting, thousands or millions are linked through shared infrastructure. The result is behavior that looks coordinated, but arises from countless local exchanges. Natural selection can favor this kind of network-level stability because stable systems last longer. A forest that distributes resources effectively is more likely to survive droughts, pests, and disturbance. That survival translates into reproduction over long timescales, both for trees and for the fungi that support them. This does not mean the forest is selecting for harmony. It is selecting for resilience. Systems that collapse under stress disappear. Systems that absorb shock persist. Cooperation is one way to absorb shock, but only when it improves efficiency. Efficiency is a quieter word than kindness, but it is far more accurate. Underground networks reduce redundancy. They smooth extremes. They allow excess in one area to offset shortage in another. They minimize waste. These are not moral virtues, they are functional ones. Research has shown that forests with intact mycorrhizal networks often exhibit more even growth and greater resistance to stress. When those networks are disrupted, individual trees may still survive, but the system becomes more brittle. Variability increases. Recovery slows. These outcomes do not imply that trees were trying to help one another. They imply that the structure enabling cooperation was removed. It is also important to recognize that cooperation is never absolute. Not every tree benefits equally. Not every interaction is supportive. Some trees gain more than they give, others are marginalized. Fungi shift alliances. Roots compete for space. Cooperation exists alongside conflict, not instead of it. This coexistence is a hallmark of natural systems. Pure competition is unstable. Pure cooperation is unrealistic. Real systems operate in between, with relationships constantly renegotiated based on conditions. The forest is no exception. Gentle humor sometimes arises when people realize how unromantic this actually is. The idea of trees being generous neighbors is comforting. The reality that they are efficient participants in a chemically mediated economy is less poetic but far more interesting. By removing moral language, the forest becomes easier to understand. Trees are not being nice, they are following rules shaped by evolution. Fungi are not being helpful, they are optimizing their own survival. The system behaves cooperatively because cooperation emerges naturally under those rules. This perspective also avoids disappointment. When forests fail to protect weaker individuals or when resource distribution appears unequal, it does not feel like a betrayal. It feels like biology doing what biology does. Systems optimize for persistence, not fairness. Understanding cooperation this way does not strip it of significance. If anything, it makes it more impressive. Without intention, without planning, and without awareness, forests achieve outcomes that human systems often struggle to replicate. Stability without control, coordination without command, adaptation without foresight. At the same time, this understanding keeps expectations realistic. Cooperation has limits. When conditions change dramatically, networks can break. When stress exceeds buffering capacity, collapse can occur. Cooperation is not a guarantee. It is a tendency shaped by constraints. This balanced view prepares the ground for what comes next. If forests cooperate without altruism, then they also compete without malice. The same rules that allow resources to flow can also restrict them. The same networks that stabilize can also exclude. By stripping away the idea of kindness, the forest does not become colder. It becomes clearer. What remains is a system driven by interaction, feedback, and survival. A system where cooperation is a strategy, not a sentiment. And once cooperation is understood in those terms, the presence of competition no longer feels like a contradiction. It feels like the other half of the same process. Beneath the forest floor, cooperation never operates alone. For every shared pathway and mutual exchange, there is also competition. Space is limited, nutrients are uneven, access matters, and the underground world reflects this reality with remarkable clarity. Roots compete first and foremost for territory. Soil may look uniform from above, but below the surface it is patchwork of pores, cracks, and compacted zones. These spaces determine where roots can grow and where water can flow. When one root system expands into a favorable channel, it physically excludes others. Growth in one direction often means denying growth in another. This competition is not aggressive. There are no attacks or defenses. It is simply a consequence of geometry. Two roots cannot occupy the same space. As they grow, they navigate around one another, sometimes retreating, sometimes pressing forward, always responding to physical constraint. Nutrients intensify this competition. Elements like nitrogen and phosphorus are rarely spread evenly through soil. They appear in pockets, released by decaying organic matter or microbial activity. Roots that reach these pockets first gain an advantage. They absorb what is available, reducing what remains for others nearby. Fungi face similar pressures. Although fungal networks can link many trees, they are still constrained by resource availability. Hyphae require carbon to grow and maintain themselves. When carbon supply drops, parts of the network retract or shut down. Connections weaken. Priorities shift. This creates trade-offs. A fungal network that connects many partners gains resilience, but also increases demand. If too many low-contributing partners draw resources, the network becomes inefficient. In response, fungi bias growth toward areas that provide better returns. Less productive links may be reduced or severed. From the outside, this looks like selective cooperation. From the inside, it is competition expressed through chemistry. Resources flow toward where they are used most effectively. Other areas receive less. No judgment is involved, only constraint. Ecological theory has long recognized that cooperation and competition are not opposites. They are intertwined. Models in theoretical ecology show that systems combining both dynamics often outperform those dominated by only one. Pure competition leads to instability. Pure cooperation leads to vulnerability. Balance produces persistence. One way to think about this is through trade-offs. Sharing resources can stabilize a system, but too much sharing reduces incentive. Exclusion can protect resources, but too much exclusion fragments the network. Forests operate in the middle ground, constantly adjusting where that balance sits. Competition also drives differentiation. Roots encountering intense competition may grow deeper, spreading vertically rather than horizontally. Others may specialize in shallow layers where organic matter accumulates. Fungi diversify as well, with different species occupying different niches. This differentiation reduces direct conflict and increases overall efficiency. In this way, competition contributes to organization rather than undermining it. By pushing organisms to exploit different strategies, it increases the functional diversity of the system. Diversity, in turn, enhances resilience. There is a tendency to imagine that intelligent behavior requires harmony, that parts must align willingly. In natural systems, the opposite is often true. Intelligence emerges from tension, from constraints that force adaptation, from limits that demand efficiency. A forest where every tree had equal access to everything would be fragile. A drought would affect all equally. A pathogen would spread unchecked. Variation in access, shaped by competition, creates uneven responses. Some trees struggle, others persist. The system survives. This unevenness can look harsh, especially when viewed through a human lens. But from a systems perspective, it is protective. Competition prevents uniform failure. It introduces friction that slows collapse. The same applies to fungal networks. By allocating resources selectively, fungi prevent waste. They ensure that carbon is not spent maintaining unproductive connections. This selectivity stabilizes the network as a whole. Gentle humor occasionally surfaces when ecologists describe this process. The underground world is often imagined as peaceful and cooperative. In reality, it is busy, crowded, and competitive. Less a quiet garden and more a constantly shifting marketplace. Importantly, competition does not negate the existence of shared systems. Roots still connect to networks. Fungi still link trees, but these connections are shaped by ongoing negotiation. They strengthen where they work and weaken where they do not. This constant adjustment gives rise to patterns that look deliberate. Resources concentrate in productive zones. Growth favors favorable paths. Stress is buffered, but not eliminated. The forest behaves as if it is optimizing, even though no one is in charge. Understanding this prevents oversimplified views of harmony. The forest is not a model of perfect cooperation. It is a system balancing many competing demands. Stability arises not because conflict is absent, but because it is regulated. Once competition is acknowledged as a fundamental part of underground dynamics, a new question naturally follows. If cooperation and competition coexist, what prevents either from dominating completely? What keeps the system from tipping into chaos or stagnation? The answer lies in regulation, in feedback, in mechanisms that respond to imbalance and push the system back toward workable states. That is where the forest's apparent intelligence becomes even clearer. Once competition and cooperation are both in play, something else becomes essential. Without regulation, one or the other would eventually dominate. Resources would either be hoarded or spread too thin. Growth would either explode uncontrollably or stall completely. Forests avoid both extremes through feedback. Feedback loops are one of the most important ideas in systems science. At their simplest, they describe situations where the outcome of a process influences the process itself. The system responds to its own behavior. Sometimes that response amplifies what is happening. Sometimes it dampens it. Either way, the system does not drift blindly. It reacts. This concept was formalized in the early 20th century, most notably through the work of Norbert Wiener, who helped develop the field of cybernetics. Wiener was interested in how systems regulate themselves without central control, how machines, organisms, and even societies could remain stable while constantly changing. The answer, again and again, was feedback. In forests, feedback is everywhere. It is not a single mechanism, but a web of responses layered on top of one another. Some act quickly, others unfold over years or decades. Together they shape how the forest behaves over time. Negative feedback is the kind most associated with stability. It works by counteracting change. When something increases too much, negative feedback pushes it back down. When something falls too low, the response nudges it upward again. A simple example appears in nutrient uptake. When a tree experiences abundant nutrients, growth accelerates, leaves expand, photosynthesis increases. But this rapid growth also increases demand. Nutrients are depleted more quickly. As availability drops, growth slows. The initial increase triggers its own restraint. Soil microbes participate in similar loops. When organic matter accumulates, microbial activity increases. Nutrients are released. Plants grow more vigorously. Over time, organic matter is consumed, reducing microbial activity and slowing nutrient release. The system oscillates, but remains within workable bounds. Positive feedback works differently. It amplifies change rather than opposing it. When a process begins, positive feedback reinforces it, often leading to rapid shifts. In forests, positive feedback is less common, but when it occurs, it can reshape entire landscapes. Fire offers a clear example. In dry conditions, fire reduces tree cover. With fewer trees, soil dries faster and temperatures rise. These conditions make future fires more likely. Each fire increases the probability of the next. This is positive feedback, and it can drive forests toward entirely new states. Because positive feedback can lead to runaway change, it is usually constrained by negative feedback elsewhere in the system. After repeated fires, vegetation composition may shift towards species that burn less readily. Moisture retention may improve. The feedback weakens. Balance returns, though often at a different baseline. What makes forests particularly resilient is the layering of many feedback loops at different scales. Root growth responds to immediate soil conditions. Fungal networks adjust resource allocation over weeks or months. Tree populations shift over decades. Each layer responds to change, but none acts alone. Consider carbon flow. When photosynthesis increases, more carbon enters the system. Some is used for growth, some is stored, some is passed to fungal partners. Increased carbon supports larger fungal networks, which improve nutrient uptake. Improved nutrition supports further growth. This is positive feedback. At the same time, increased growth increases water demand. If water becomes limiting, growth slows. Carbon input decreases. Fungal activity adjusts. The positive loop is checked by a negative one. The system does not spiral out of control. These interactions do not require monitoring or planning. They arise because biological processes are constrained by physical limits. Water availability, nutrient concentration, temperature, and energy balance impose boundaries. Feedback is how the system stays within them. From the outside, this can look like decision-making. The forest appears to know when to slow down, when to recover, and when to change strategy. In reality, it is responding mechanically to changing conditions. The appearance of intelligence emerges from the reliability of those responses. One reason feedback is so powerful is that it operates continuously. There is no delay waiting for information to reach a central authority. Changes are detected locally and responded to locally. That response then propagates through the system. This local responsiveness makes forests robust. Damage in one area does not immediately destabilize the whole. Feedback loops absorb the shock. Growth patterns shift. Resource flows adjust. The system finds a new equilibrium. Gentle humour sometimes helps make this idea intuitive. Forests do not hold meetings to discuss strategy. They do not vote on how to respond to drought. They simply react over and over again in ways shaped by millions of years of evolutionary tuning. Feedback also explains why forest behaviour can change without losing coherence. A young forest behaves differently from an old one. A recovering forest behaves differently from a stable one. Yet in each case, responses remain proportional. Extremes are moderated. Runaway processes are restrained. Importantly, feedback does not eliminate change. It manages it. Forests are never static. They're always adjusting, responding to weather, organisms, and internal dynamics. Feedback ensures that these adjustments do not tear the system apart. This distinction matters. Stability in natural systems does not mean stillness. It means persistence through change. Feedback allows forests to remain forests even as individual trees grow, die, and are replaced. The same principles apply across scales. At the cellular level, biochemical feedback regulates hormone production. At the organism level, growth adjusts to resource availability. At the ecosystem level, population dynamics shift in response to stress. Each layer contributes to the whole. Seeing forests through this lens removes the need for central control entirely. Balance does not require oversight. It emerges from constraint, interaction, and response. Feedback is the mechanism that turns complexity into coherence. Understanding feedback also clarifies why forests can recover. When disturbance pushes the system away from equilibrium, feedback loops guide it back, not necessarily to its previous state, but to a viable one. Recovery is not reversal. It is reorganization within limits. Once this becomes clear, the forest behavior looks less mysterious and more inevitable. Given enough interacting components, feedback is not optional. It is the only way stability can exist at all, and yet feedback alone does not tell the full story. It explains balance during normal conditions, but not what happens when those conditions are violently disrupted. Fire, drought, storms, and disease can overwhelm feedback mechanisms, at least temporarily. What happens then is not a failure of intelligence, but a test of it. That is where disturbance enters the picture, and where the forest's ability to remember, adapt, and recover becomes visible. Disturbance is not an interruption to forest life, it is part of it. Fire, drought, insects, wind, and disease have shaped forests for as long as forests have existed. What matters is not whether disturbance happens, but how a forest responds when it does. Some disturbances arrive suddenly. A wildfire moves through in hours. A storm snaps trunks and tears canopies apart. Others unfold slowly. Drought tightens its grip over months or years. Pests spread gradually, weakening trees one by one. From the outside, these events can look like chaos. From within the system, they are signals. Forests respond to disturbance in ways that reflect both their present condition and their past. A fire does not meet a blank slate. It meets a landscape shaped by previous fires, previous droughts, and previous recoveries. That history matters. Consider fire first. In many ecosystems, fire's been a regular presence rather than a rare disaster. Some tree species have thick bark that resists heat. Others drop cones that only open after exposure to fire. Some rely on fire to clear competition and release nutrients locked in organic matter. These traits did not arise by chance. They reflect long exposure to recurring disturbance. When fire passes through such a forest, the response is not random. Certain species survive, others regenerate quickly. Soil chemistry shifts, but microbial communities often rebound faster than expected. Nutrients released by burned material become available for new growth. What looks like destruction at the surface can trigger renewal below. Drought offers a different challenge. Water scarcity stresses trees slowly, reducing growth and weakening defenses. Some trees close their stomata to conserve moisture, limiting photosynthesis. Others extend roots deeper, searching for reserves. Fungal networks adjust as well, reallocating resources and reducing activity where carbon supply drops. Importantly, drought responses depend heavily on what the forest has experienced before. A forest that has endured previous dry periods often responds more effectively than one encountering drought for the first time. Root systems may already be deeper. Microbial communities may be better adapted to low moisture. Species composition may favor more tolerant trees. This is where the idea of ecological memory becomes useful. Memory in this context does not reside in thoughts or awareness. It resides in structure, in the composition of the soil, in the species present, in the genetic makeup of populations shaped by past conditions. Soil is a major repository of this memory. After a disturbance, the soil does not reset. Microbial communities shift, but they do not vanish. Organic matter accumulates or burns. Nutrient pools change form. These changes influence how the forest responds the next time conditions shift. For example, repeated fires can alter soil chemistry in ways that favor certain microbes over others. Those microbes, in turn, affect nutrient availability and plant growth. Over time, the forest becomes tuned to fire, not because it remembers in any conscious sense, but because its internal configuration reflects a history of exposure. Long-term forest studies have been crucial in revealing these patterns. Organizations such as the United States Forest Service have maintained research plots for decades, tracking how forests change through multiple disturbance cycles. These studies show that recovery is rarely identical each time. Past events leave traces that shape future outcomes. Insect outbreaks provide another window into ecological memory. When pests sweep through a forest, they rarely affect all trees equally. Some individuals resist attack better than others. These survivors contribute disproportionately to the next generation. Over time, resistance becomes more common. At the same time, microbial communities associated with roots may shift in response to pest damage, influencing nutrient cycling and plant health. The forest that emerges after an outbreak is not the same as the one before. It carries a record of what it endured. Physical damage such as wind throw creates similar effects. When trees fall, light floods the forest floor. Temperature and moisture conditions change. Species adapted to shade give way to those that thrive in openness. Roots decay, releasing nutrients. Fungal networks reorganize. The disturbance rewrites the local rules. What is striking is how often forests recover functionality even when they do not return to their previous appearance. Structure changes, species composition shifts, yet nutrient cycling resumes. Growth stabilizes. Feedback loops re-establish themselves. The system adapts rather than restoring a fixed form. This ability to adapt depends on diversity, but it also depends on memory. A forest with no memory would respond to each disturbance as if it were unprecedented. Recovery would be slow and uncertain. In reality, forests often rebound more quickly than expected, because their internal organization has been shaped by earlier challenges. Memory can even be encoded at the molecular level. Some plants exhibit changes in gene expression, following stress that persist across seasons. These changes do not alter the DNA sequence, but they influence how genes are activated. The result is a form of biological preparedness, carried forward without awareness. Again, this does not imply foresight. No tree anticipates drought, no microbe plans for fire, but systems shaped by past selection tend to respond more effectively when similar conditions recur. The memory is statistical rather than narrative. Gentle humour sometimes emerges when scientists describe this. Forests, they say, have been here before. The phrase sounds anthropomorphic, but the point is structural. The system has been shaped by repetition. Understanding ecological memory helps resolve a common misconception. When a forest fails to recover after severe disturbance, it is tempting to view this as a loss of intelligence. In reality, the disturbance may have exceeded the range the system was built to handle. Memory has limits. When conditions change too rapidly or too severely, past adaptations may no longer apply. This is especially relevant under changing climate conditions. Disturbance regimes are shifting. Fires burn hotter. Droughts last longer. Pest ranges expand. Forests carry memories of a different past. Whether those memories remain useful is an open question. Even so, the concept of memory without minds remains powerful. It shows how history can influence behaviour without being remembered in any conscious way. It explains why forests often respond coherently to stress, drawing on structural legacies rather than planning. It also reinforces the idea that intelligence, as it appears in forests, is not about prediction. It is about persistence. Systems that incorporate the effects of past conditions into their present structure respond more effectively than those that do not. As disturbances accumulate, forests do not simply endure them. They are shaped by them. Each fire, drought, or outbreak leaves an imprint. Those imprints guide future responses, narrowing some possibilities and opening others. This layered history gives forests a kind of depth. What is happening now is never just about the present. It is the outcome of many past interactions, encoded in soil, species, and structure. Seeing this makes forest behaviour feel less mysterious and more grounded. The forest does not remember in the way a mind remembers. It remembers in the way a river remembers its banks, through form, through constraint, through the paths carved by repetition. That memory sets the stage for the next question. If forests can store the influence of the past without thought, then their capacity to withstand future change depends on how flexible that stored structure is. That flexibility is what resilience rests on, and resilience in turn depends on diversity. Walk into two forests side by side, and they can look similar at first glance. Trees, shade, leaf litter. But beneath that surface, their internal structure may be very different. One may be diverse, filled with many species of trees, fungi, microbes, and insects. The other may be a monoculture, dominated by a single species repeated again and again. When conditions are calm, both can appear healthy. When stress arrives, the difference becomes obvious. Diverse forests recover more effectively than uniform ones because they do not rely on a single strategy. They spread risk, they distribute function, they avoid putting all their resources into one way of surviving. In a monoculture, every tree tends to respond to stress in the same way. If drought arrives, all trees close their stomata at similar thresholds. If a pest evolves to exploit that species, it finds a continuous supply of hosts. If a pathogen spreads, there are few natural breaks to slow it down. Uniformity creates efficiency under stable conditions, but vulnerability under change. Diversity disrupts this pattern. Different species respond differently to the same challenge. Some tolerate drought better, others resist pests, some grow quickly after disturbance, while others persist slowly but steadily. When stress affects one group, others continue functioning. The forest does not fail all at once. This principle is well known in ecology and aligns closely with ideas from network theory. In network science, redundancy refers to having multiple pathways that can perform similar functions. Robustness refers to a system's ability to maintain overall function, even when parts are damaged or removed. A forest with diverse species and interactions has many overlapping pathways. Nutrients can move through multiple fungal partners. Carbon can be processed by different microbial communities. Energy can flow through different food webs. If one pathway weakens, others compensate. This does not mean every pathway is equal. Some are more efficient, some are more costly. But the presence of alternatives prevents catastrophic failure. The system bends rather than breaks. Ecological research has repeatedly demonstrated this effect. Long-term studies comparing species-rich forests with simplified ones show that diverse systems tend to maintain more stable productivity over time. Their growth fluctuates less dramatically. Their recovery from disturbance is faster. Their nutrient cycles are smoother. Importantly, this stability does not come from any single species being particularly strong. It comes from variation. Each species occupies a slightly different niche. Each responds to conditions in its own way. Together, they cover a wider range of possibilities than any one species could alone. This distribution of responses is what spreads risk. A drought severe enough to suppress one species may leave another largely unaffected. A pest outbreak targeting a particular tree may spare its neighbours. The loss of function in one part of the system is offset by persistence elsewhere. Fungal diversity plays a similar role underground. Different fungi specialise in different nutrients, soil types, and host relationships. Some perform better in dry conditions. Others thrive when moisture is abundant. When conditions shift, the balance between these partners changes, but the network remains active. Microbial diversity adds yet another layer. Bacteria and fungi differ in how they process organic matter, release nutrients, and interact with roots. A diverse microbial community can continue cycling nutrients even if some members decline. This continuity supports plant growth during stress. From a systems perspective, diversity increases the number of ways the forest can function. It expands the solution space. When one route closes, another opens. The forest does not need to predict which challenge will come next. It only needs enough variation to respond when it does. This is where the appearance of intelligence becomes stronger. A system that continues functioning across a wide range of conditions looks as though it is adapting deliberately. In reality, it is drawing on pre-existing diversity. The response is not chosen. It is revealed. Gentle humour sometimes helps make this intuitive. A forest is less like a specialist trained for one task and more like a group of generalists, each good at something slightly different. When the unexpected happens, someone is always somewhat prepared. This perspective also explains why diversity can sometimes reduce short-term efficiency. A monoculture may grow faster under ideal conditions. Resources are channeled along the most direct paths. There is little redundancy. Everything is optimized for the present. Diversity trades some of that efficiency for resilience. It introduces overlap and variation. It slows things down slightly, but it ensures that when conditions change, the system does not collapse. This trade-off is not accidental. Over evolutionary time, environments are rarely stable for long. Systems that prioritize flexibility tend to persist. Those that optimize narrowly tend to fail when circumstances shift. Diversity also influences how disturbances propagate. In a uniform forest, stress spreads easily because responses are synchronized. In a diverse forest, responses are asynchronous. Some trees slow growth, others continue. Some areas recover quickly, others lag. This unevenness prevents runaway effects. The same principle applies to disease. Pathogens spread more slowly when hosts differ. Chemical signaling varies. Defense strategies differ. The pathogen encounters barriers rather than highways. All of this contributes to a form of structural intelligence, not intelligence located in any organism, but intelligence embedded in arrangement. The forest does not need to know what is coming. Its diversity ensures that something will work when it arrives. This also reframes conservation in practical terms. Preserving diversity is not just about saving species for their own sake. It is about maintaining the functional capacity of systems. Diversity keeps options open. When diversity is lost, those options disappear. Networks become thinner. Redundancy vanishes. Robustness declines. The forest becomes more dependent on specific conditions and more vulnerable to disruption. Understanding this prepares the ground for a harder truth. If diversity strengthens networks, then its loss weakens them. The same mechanisms that create resilience can, when stripped away, expose fragility. Diversity is not decoration, it is infrastructure. And when infrastructure fails, the consequences ripple far beyond what is immediately visible. When underground networks break, the change does not always announce itself. The canopy can still look green. Birds can still move through branches. From a distance, the scene may still read as forest. But the behaviors that make a forest resilient begin to fade, because the hidden infrastructure that supports them has been cut, compacted, or chemically altered. One of the fastest ways to fracture those underground connections is heavy logging. Removing trees does more than remove wood. It removes carbon supply. Fungi that form mycorrhizal partnerships rely on sugars produced by trees. When large numbers of trees are felled, that carbon stream drops sharply. Roots die back. Hyphae retract. The network that once stitched many individuals together breaks into smaller islands. This matters because fungal networks are not just decoration around roots. They are delivery routes. A living mesh that expands the effective reach of roots, moving phosphorus, nitrogen, water and trace minerals through soil pores that roots alone cannot access. When those roots collapse, trees are left with a smaller foraging range and fewer options. A forest that once behaved like an integrated system begins to behave like isolated individuals sharing the same ground. Selective logging and clear cutting create different outcomes, and modern forestry research has been increasingly focused on that contrast. When some mature trees are left standing, they can act as living anchors for the fungal community. Carbon still enters the soil. Some network continuity remains. When everything's removed, the underground loses continuity, and recovery becomes far slower even if seedlings are planted immediately. Soil compaction is often the next strike. Heavy machinery compresses soil, collapsing pore spaces that normally hold air and water. Those pores are not minor details. They are the architecture of the underground. Roots need them to grow. Fungi need them to spread. Microbes need them to breathe. When pores collapse, oxygen drops, water movement changes, and whole microbial communities shift. Nutrient cycling slows. The soil becomes less alive in the ways a forest depends on. Compaction also creates a cruel kind of delay. A canopy can regrow faster than a soil structure can repair itself. Even after tree cover returns, roots may remain shallow, fungal networks remain thin, and microbial activity remains altered. The forest appears recovered while its hidden systems are still functioning with reduced capacity. Land use change can take this one step further. When forests are converted to agriculture, repeated tilling physically shears fungal hyphae again and again. Fertilizer changes the underground economy by providing nutrients directly, reducing the advantage of fungal trade networks. Pesticides and herbicides can alter microbial composition. Crop rotations simplify the plant community, and simplified plant communities tend to support simplified fungal communities. Even if farmland is later abandoned and trees return, the soil often carries the legacy of that disruption for years or decades. Urban development is its own category of network breakage. Roads, buildings, and hard surfaces seal soil, cutting off gas exchange and limiting water infiltration. Roots are confined to narrow corridors. Fungi cannot spread freely. Microbial diversity often drops. The result is that urban trees can look healthy for a time, but they are frequently operating without the kind of underground support that makes forests stable. The difference is not just aesthetic, it is functional. When networks break, the first major consequence is usually a decline in nutrient access. Nutrients may still be present in soil tests, but availability and delivery are not the same thing. Phosphorus, for example, often binds tightly to soil particles. Mycorrhizal fungi are particularly good at acquiring it. When fungal networks are degraded, trees may show phosphorus limitation, even in soils that contain plenty of phosphorus overall. The forest is surrounded by resources it cannot reach efficiently. Water buffering also weakens. Intact fungal networks can help trees access water held in tiny soil spaces. They can also influence soil structure indirectly by supporting microbial communities that contribute to aggregation. When networks are disrupted, soil can become more prone to drying and less able to hold water evenly. During drought, trees become stressed earlier and recover more slowly. These stresses do not remain isolated. A nutrient-stressed tree often produces fewer defensive compounds. A water-stressed tree may become more vulnerable to pests and pathogens. This is how cascading effects begin. One disruption amplifies another. What started as broken infrastructure becomes increased susceptibility. Institutions such as the United States Forest Service and other long-term research organizations have tracked these cascading patterns across decades. One of the clearest findings from many long-term forest plots is that degraded soils and disrupted underground communities are linked with slower recovery after disturbance. When a storm, drought, or insect outbreak hits a forest with weakened underground networks, the impacts can be larger and longer lasting. The system has less capacity to buffer and redistribute stress. A particularly revealing sign of the network breakdown is increased variability. In an intact forest, growth and health often show a kind of coherence. Not perfect uniformity, but a consistent pattern across many individuals. In disrupted forests, extremes become common. Some trees grow quickly, while others stall. Mortality becomes patchy. Regeneration becomes uneven. The forest loses its collective rhythm. This loss of system-level behavior is easy to misunderstand. It can be tempting to blame poor seedlings, bad weather, or unlucky timing. Those factors matter, but they do not fully explain why a replanted area sometimes struggles even when light and rainfall are adequate. The deeper reason is often that the underground support system has not returned. A tree can be planted into soil, but it cannot be planted into a functioning network unless that network is already present or able to rebuild. It is also worth noting that network loss can make forests look deceptively stable in the short term. A mature forest might persist for years with weakened underground connectivity, because large trees carry stored reserves and deep root systems. The fragility becomes obvious later when a second stress arrives. A drought that would once have been survivable becomes lethal. A pest outbreak spreads faster and hits harder. The forest seems to fail suddenly, but the underlying weakening happened earlier. Gentle humour sometimes appears in the way ecologists talk about this, because the contrast is so striking. Above ground, everything can look like business as usual. Below ground, it can be a half-powered version of the original system. The forest still has the costume, but not the full performance. Network breakage also shifts which species can thrive. Some trees depend more heavily on mycorrhizal partnerships than others. Some fungi are more sensitive to soil disturbance. When networks are repeatedly disrupted, species that rely on stable fungal relationships may decline, while more disturbance-tolerant species increase. Over time, the forest composition changes. This is not a moral story about good and bad land use. It is a mechanical story about which strategies function under altered conditions. The relevance extends beyond forests because the same principles apply in many ecosystems. Grasslands rely on mycorrhizal fungi and diverse microbial communities to maintain soil structure and nutrient cycling. Wetlands depend on complex microbial processes to regulate carbon and nitrogen. Agricultural soils, when treated as living networks rather than inert substrate, often retain fertility more reliably and require fewer external inputs. When these networks are disrupted, systems become dependent on constant replacement of what used to be recycled internally. This is why restoration has increasingly moved beyond tree planting toward rebuilding function. Soil protection, reduced compaction, careful harvesting methods, and in some cases deliberate fungal inoculation are all attempts to restore connectivity rather than just cover. In conservation research, the focus is shifting from how many trees are present to whether the system can regulate itself again. The broader lesson is simple and slightly unsettling. A forest can survive the loss of individuals. It struggles when it loses connection. When networks break, the system becomes less able to distribute resources, less able to spread information, less able to buffer stress, and less able to recover after disturbance. And that is the most important point. The intelligence-like behavior of forests does not vanish because trees become less alive. It vanishes because coordination becomes harder. The same local responses still exist, but they no longer add up to a coherent whole. When networks break, the forest does not stop functioning. It stops functioning together. At this point, many of the pieces are already on the table: roots that sense and respond, fungal networks that distribute resources, chemical signals that move information without nerves, competition that sharpens outcomes, feedback loops that stabilize behavior, disturbance that leaves lasting structural traces, diversity that spreads risk. What remains is to recognize what kind of thing a forest actually is when all of this is taken together. In systems science, there is a term for systems built this way: complex adaptive systems. A complex adaptive system is made up of many interacting parts. No single part controls the whole. Each part follows local rules, responding to immediate conditions. From those interactions, larger patterns emerge. The system adapts over time, not because it plans to, but because successful configurations persist while unsuccessful ones fade. Forests fit this description almost uncomfortably well. They are complex because they involve many layers operating at once: trees, fungi, bacteria, insects, soil chemistry, water flow, climate, and disturbance all interact simultaneously. None of these layers can be fully understood in isolation. Each shapes and is shaped by the others. They're adaptive because they change in response to conditions. Growth rates shift. Species composition adjusts. Resource flows reorganize. After disturbance, the system does not simply resume its previous state, it finds a new workable arrangement. And they are systems because the behavior of the whole cannot be reduced to the behavior of any single part. Remove one tree and the forest remains a forest. Remove connectivity and the behavior changes fundamentally. Complexity theory emerged from efforts to understand exactly this kind of behavior. Physicists, biologists, and mathematicians began noticing that systems, as different as weather patterns, ecosystems, economies, and even traffic flow, shared common features. Order appeared without instruction. Stability emerged from interaction. Patterns repeated across scales. Interdisciplinary research began to show that complexity does not require complicated rules. In fact, it often arises from very simple ones applied repeatedly. Feedback, constraint, variation, and selection are enough to generate structure. In forests, these ingredients are everywhere. Feedback regulates growth. Constraints limit expansion. Variation introduces multiple strategies. Selection filters what persists. Over time, the system self-organizes. This is why forests can appear purposeful without being designed. They grow in ways that seem efficient. They recover in ways that seem strategic. They respond to stress in ways that look anticipatory. Yet no foresight is involved. The appearance of purpose arises because inefficient configurations do not last. A forest structure that collapses under drought disappears. One that distributes resources more evenly persists. Over many cycles, the surviving arrangements give the impression of intention. This can feel unsettling because human intuition associates purpose with planning. In engineered systems, that association holds. In natural systems, it does not. Purpose-like behavior emerges from filtering, not foresight. Physics plays a quiet role here. Energy flows impose direction. Entropy imposes limits. Systems organize not because they defy physical laws, but because they follow them. Energy enters through sunlight. It moves through photosynthesis into chemical bonds. It is distributed, transformed, and eventually dissipated. Forests structure channels that flow. From this perspective, a forest is not a static object. It is a process, a pattern sustained by continuous throughput of energy and matter. Stop the flow and the structure dissolves. This process view helps unify everything described so far. Roots sense because sensing improves resource acquisition. Networks form because networks move energy and nutrients more effectively. Signaling exists because early response reduces damage. Diversity persists because it broadens adaptive range. None of these features exist in isolation. They reinforce one another. Networks enable signaling. Signaling influences growth. Growth reshapes networks. Feedback links everything together. What is particularly striking is how little central coordination is required. No master blueprint dictates where roots grow or how fungi connect. Local interactions are enough. The forest builds itself. Researchers studying complexity often emphasize that such systems are poised between order and disorder. Too much order, and the system becomes rigid. Too much disorder, and it collapses. Forests operate in this middle ground, structured enough to be stable, flexible enough to adapt. This balance explains why forests can be both resilient and vulnerable. They absorb many disturbances, but not all. When pushed beyond certain thresholds, feedback loops break down and the system reorganizes, sometimes into something entirely different. Complex adaptive systems also exhibit nonlinear behavior. Small changes can have large effects. Large changes can sometimes have surprisingly small impacts. This is why predicting forest responses is so difficult. Outcomes depend not just on the size of a disturbance, but on timing, context, and existing structure. A mild drought following a fire may have little effect. The same drought following years of stress may trigger widespread mortality. The difference lies in the system's internal state. This sensitivity does not mean forests are fragile. It means they are dynamic. Their behavior reflects history as much as present conditions. From a scientific standpoint, framing forests as complex adaptive systems is not poetic. It is practical. It changes how questions are asked. Instead of asking how to control forests, researchers ask how forests regulate themselves. Instead of focusing on single variables, they examine interactions. This shift has influenced conservation, forestry, and restoration. Protecting individual trees matters, but protecting connectivity matters more. Managing for yield alone ignores feedback and diversity. Supporting system function produces more reliable outcomes, Gentle humour sometimes appears in this context because the idea feels oddly familiar. Humans build complex systems too, and often struggle to manage them. Traffic systems, power grids, financial markets all exhibit similar behaviour. Attempts at central control frequently produce unintended consequences. Forests avoid this problem not because they are smarter, but because they never try to control themselves. They rely on interaction and feedback instead. This comparison helps broaden relevance beyond ecology. The principles at work in forests apply to many natural systems. Coral reefs, immune systems, brain networks, even planetary climate exhibits features of a complex adaptive system. What differs is scale and medium, not logic. Recognizing this does not reduce forests to abstractions. It grounds their behaviour in a framework that makes sense of both their beauty and their unpredictability. It explains why forests can feel alive in a collective way without possessing a collective mind. The forest does not know what it is doing, and it does not need to. Its structure embodies the accumulated outcomes of countless interactions shaped by physical limits and evolutionary time. That structure allows behaviour that works, most of the time, under most conditions. Seeing forests this way unifies everything that came before. Sensing, signalling, cooperation, competition, feedback, memory, diversity, and breakdown all become aspects of the same underlying process. A forest is not intelligent because it thinks. It is intelligent because it is organized. And organization, when it emerges at sufficient scale, can look remarkably like purpose. With that framework in place, forests no longer need special explanations. They become one of many examples of how complexity gives rise to behaviour that feels meaningful without ever being planned. And once that idea settles, comparison becomes inevitable. Forests are not unique in this regard. They are simply one of the clearest places where the logic of complex adaptive systems can be watched, slowly, quietly, and in plain sight. Once forests are seen as complex adaptive systems, a surprising shift occurs. They stop looking unusual. Instead, they start looking familiar. The behaviours observed beneath trees are not isolated curiosities. They echo patterns found across nature, in systems that seem very different on the surface, but operate according to similar rules underneath. The forest is not an exception, it is an example. Consider ant colonies. An individual ant has limited capability. It follows simple behavioural rules. It responds to chemical cues, temperature, and physical contact. No single ant understands the structure of the colony, and yet ant colonies build intricate nests, regulate temperature, allocate labour, and respond dynamically to threats. The intelligence of the colony does not reside in any ant. It emerges from interaction. When food is found, chemical trails strengthen. When danger appears, movement patterns shift. Feedback amplifies useful behaviour and suppresses ineffective ones. The colony adapts without planning. Forests behave in much the same way. Trees respond locally to moisture, nutrients, and chemical signals. Fungal networks strengthen where exchanges are productive. Growth patterns shift in response to stress. The forest adapts without awareness. The parallel is not superficial, it is structural. Both systems rely on distributed decision-making, feedback loops, and local interactions scaled up over time. Neither system requires a leader. Neither requires a blueprint. Order emerges because the rules allow it. The immune system provides another striking comparison. It protects the body against a constantly changing array of threats. It identifies unfamiliar molecules, remembers past encounters, and adjusts future responses. And yet, no single cell knows the body it protects. Immune cells follow chemical gradients. They bind to specific molecular patterns. Successful responses are reinforced through proliferation. Ineffective responses fade. Memory is stored not in thought, but in altered populations of cells and signaling pathways. This mirrors ecological memory in forests. Past disturbances reshape soil communities, species composition, and structural relationships. Future responses are influenced by what has happened before, not because the forest remembers, but because its internal configuration has changed. Neural networks add another layer of familiarity. Individual neurons are simple. They respond to electrical and chemical inputs. They fire or remain quiet based on thresholds. No neuron understands a thought. And yet, networks of neurons give rise to perception, learning, and behavior. Learning in neural systems occurs through changes in connection strength. Pathways that are used become stronger, those that are not weaken. Over time, patterns stabilize. The system becomes better at responding to familiar inputs. Forests exhibit analogous processes. Root and fungal connections strengthen where exchange is frequent. Networks reorganize in response to repeated conditions. Pathways that support persistence remain, those that do not fade. The logic is the same, even though the medium is different. What matters in all these cases is not the components themselves, but how they interact. Ants, immune cells, neurons, and trees share very little biologically. What they share is organization. Network science has spent decades formalizing this idea. Researchers have shown that many systems can be represented as networks of nodes connected by links. The details differ, but certain patterns recur. Clusters form, hubs emerge, redundant pathways increase resilience. Too much centralization increases vulnerability. These principles appear again and again in ecosystems, in brains, in social systems, in technological networks. The repetition is not coincidental. It reflects underlying constraints imposed by physics, energy flow, and information processing. This repetition leads to the idea of universality. In complexity science, universality refers to the observation that very different systems can exhibit similar behavior when they share core structural features. The same mathematical descriptions can sometimes apply to phenomena as distant as phase transitions in materials and population dynamics in ecology. Forests fall comfortably within this framework. Their behavior is not unique. It is what tends to happen when many interacting components operate under feedback and constraint. This perspective removes the temptation to elevate forests to a special category. They are not mysterious minds hidden in plain sight. They are instances of a broader pattern playing out in biological form. Gentle humour often emerges when this realization sinks in. The forest, it turns out, behaves a lot like an ant colony, an immune system, or a brain, despite sharing almost nothing with them. Nature seems to reuse good ideas. Importantly, the similarities are not about appearance. Ant colonies do not look like forests. Immune systems do not resemble fungal networks. Neural circuits do not resemble root systems. The shared features lie in dynamics, distributed control, local rules, feedback-driven adaptation. This distinction matters because it prevents shallow analogies. Forests are not brains. Trees do not think. Ants do not reason. The intelligence, like behavior, arises not from cognition, but from organization. Seeing this helps place forests in context. They are not special cases that require special explanations. They follow the same principles that govern many other complex systems. This also explains why intelligence, when defined too narrowly, causes confusion. If intelligence is equated exclusively with thought, then forests appear paradoxical. If intelligence is understood as effective adaptive behavior arising from interaction, then forests fit comfortably within the concept. The forest becomes illustrative rather than exceptional, a clear, tangible example of how complex systems behave when conditions allow. This broader view also protects against romantic exaggeration. It avoids the trap of attributing wisdom or intention where none exists. The forest does not know what it is doing any more than an immune cell does. But both can behave in ways that are remarkably effective. At the same time, this perspective preserves significance. Organization without awareness is not trivial. It is powerful. It is the reason life can persist under changing conditions. It is the reason systems can adapt without foresight. Understanding forests as one instance of a universal pattern allows lessons to travel. Insights from ecology inform neuroscience. Insights from network science inform conservation. The boundaries between disciplines soften. This interdisciplinary exchange is not decorative, it is practical. It helps scientists recognize when they are studying the same phenomenon under different names. Feedback, adaptation, emergence, resilience. Forests, in this sense, become teachers. Not because they are conscious, but because they are legible. Their slow timescales and visible structures make abstract principles easier to observe. Once these patterns are recognized, the forest no longer feels like an anomaly that demands explanation. It feels like a familiar system operating in a familiar way, just expressed through wood, soil, and fungi rather than neurons or cells. That recognition leads naturally to a final shift. If forests are one example among many, then intelligence itself may need redefining, not as a property of minds, but as a property of organized interaction. And that shift opens the door to a quieter, broader understanding of intelligence altogether. The way forests are described matters more than it first appears. Words do not merely report observations, they frame them. They shape what feels intuitive, what feels strange, and what feels plausible. In the study of forest networks, language has often been both a bridge and a barrier. Terms like communication, cooperation, sharing, and memory are powerful because they connect unfamiliar processes to familiar human experience. They help people grasp complex interactions quickly. When a scientist says that trees communicate, the listener immediately imagines signals, responses, and coordination. Something clicks. But the same words can also mislead. Anthropomorphic language, language that assigns human traits to non-human systems, carries assumptions along with meaning. Communication suggests intent. Sharing implies generosity. Memory hints at awareness. These implications are rarely what scientists mean, yet they can quietly reshape understanding. This tension is not unique to forest science. It runs through all of biology. Genes are said to want to replicate. Cells are described as deciding to divide. Immune systems are said to recognize enemies. None of these statements imply conscious thought, yet the language inevitably pulls interpretation in that direction. Scientists are well aware of this problem. The continued use of metaphor is not carelessness. It is a practical compromise. Biological systems are extraordinarily complex. Describing them with purely technical language can be accurate but inaccessible. Metaphors compress explanation. They allow ideas to travel across disciplines and into public understanding. Without them, much of modern science would remain locked behind walls of jargon. When forest ecologists talk about trees sharing carbon, they are not claiming moral behavior. They are describing measured flows of molecules through physical networks. The metaphor is shorthand, not assertion. It saves time and creates intuition, but it must be handled carefully. The difficulty arises when shorthand hardens into belief. When metaphors are taken literally, forests begin to look like societies. Trees become neighbors. Networks become conversations. The science has not changed, but the interpretation has drifted. Philosophers of science have spent decades examining this issue. Language, they argue, is not a neutral vessel. It actively shapes models and explanations. The words chosen influence what questions are asked and which answers feel satisfying. Explanatory language always balances precision and usability. Too much precision and understanding collapses under detail. Too much metaphor and accuracy erodes. Good science communication lives in the narrow space between. This balance is especially delicate when discussing intelligence. Intelligence is a word heavily weighted by human experience. It implies reasoning, awareness, and purpose. When applied loosely, it invites confusion. When avoided entirely, it can obscure real patterns of adaptive behavior. That is why many scientists speak of intelligent-like behavior rather than intelligence itself. The phrase signals similarity without identity. It acknowledges effectiveness without implying thought. Careful wording helps preserve this distinction. Saying that a forest behaves intelligently is not the same as saying it is intelligent. The first describes an outcome. The second assigns a property. One refers to observable patterns. The other implies internal states. The same care applies to communication. Plants do not communicate in the way animals do. They do not encode meaning or interpret messages. They release chemicals. Other organisms respond. The interaction is causal, not conversational. Yet calling this signaling rather than communication can sometimes obscure the functional similarity. Signals move information. They alter behavior. From a systems perspective, that is enough to justify the metaphor, provided its limits are understood. This is why scientific writing often alternates between metaphor and clarification. A paper may describe roots communicating through fungal networks, then immediately specify that no cognition or intent is involved. The metaphor opens the door. The clarification keeps it grounded. Gentle humour sometimes appears in these discussions as a release valve. Scientists joke about trees talking, then quickly remind listeners that the conversation is entirely chemical. The humour acknowledges the metaphor while diffusing its excesses. Language also influences emotional response. Anthropomorphic descriptions can inspire care and curiosity. They make forests feel relatable. This can be valuable in conservation, where emotional engagement matters. But it can also lead to disappointment when forests behave in ways that do not align with human values. A forest does not protect the weak. It does not act fairly. It does not aim for harmony. When these realities conflict with romantic language, trust can erode. Clear wording helps prevent that mismatch. The goal is not to strip science of poetry, it is to align imagery with mechanism, to allow wonder without distortion. Careful language also supports better scientific thinking. When metaphors are treated as models rather than truths, they can be tested, refined, or discarded. When they are mistaken for literal descriptions, they resist correction. This matters because forests are often invoked in broader discussions about intelligence, cooperation, and even ethics. Sloppy language can blur boundaries between description and prescription. Precision keeps those boundaries intact. In recent years, many researchers have become more explicit about their terminology. Papers increasingly include sections clarifying what is meant by terms like memory, learning, or decision-making. This reflects a growing awareness that language shapes not just public understanding, but scientific discourse itself. The challenge is ongoing. New discoveries demand new words. Old words carry baggage. There is no perfect vocabulary waiting to be adopted, only careful, reflective use of the tools available. Understanding this makes earlier chapters clearer. When forests are described as remembering, the reference is to persistent structural change. When they are said to communicate, the reference is to chemical signaling. When they are described as cooperating, the reference is to mutually beneficial exchange shaped by selection. None of these require minds. None of them require intention. The language points toward function, not experience. By keeping this distinction in view, the forest remains fascinating without becoming mystical. Its behaviour can be admired without being misunderstood. Its complexity can be explored without being anthropomorphized beyond usefulness. Language does not just describe the forest. It guides the path taken to understand it. When words are chosen carefully, they illuminate rather than obscure. This careful framing prepares the ground for the final shift. Once language is aligned with mechanism, the need to defend forests against misinterpretation fades. They no longer need to be protected from claims they never made. Instead, they can be appreciated for what they are. Not thinking beings, but systems whose organization produces behavior that feels meaningful because it works. And recognizing that difference is the last step in seeing forests clearly. The question that opened this journey sounded deceptively simple. If forests cannot think, why do they behave as if they do? After moving through roots and fungi, signals and feedback, disturbance and recovery, the question no longer feels quite the same. It has stretched, it has softened, it has changed shape. What once seemed like a puzzle about hidden minds now looks more like a puzzle about definitions. Intelligence is a word that humans have grown accustomed to using in a very narrow way. It is usually treated as a possession, something an organism has or lacks, something located inside a brain, expressed through reasoning, planning, and awareness. By that definition, forests clearly fail the test. They have no neurons, no thoughts, no experience of the world at all. And yet, the behavior remains. Forests adapt. They respond to stress. They reorganize after damage. They distribute resources, regulate extremes, and persist through change. These are not trivial accomplishments. They are exactly the kinds of outcomes intelligence is often invoked to explain. The tension dissolves once intelligence is reframed not as a thing, but as a process. Across cognitive science and biology, there has been a growing recognition that intelligence does not need to be confined to minds. Some researchers argue that intelligence is best understood as the ability of a system to generate appropriate responses to changing conditions. Others describe it as the capacity to maintain function under uncertainty. Still, others emphasize information processing, feedback, and adaptation. In each case, intelligence becomes something that happens rather than something that exists. This shift mirrors what has already been seen in forests. No single tree is intelligent, no fungal strand is clever, but the system formed by their interaction produces behavior that works. The intelligence is not located anywhere. It is distributed across relationships. This idea challenges a long-standing habit of separating thinking systems from non-thinking ones. Instead of drawing a sharp line between intelligence and non-intelligence, it suggests a continuum. Simple systems respond in simple ways. More complex systems respond in richer, more flexible ways. At no point does a clear boundary appear. From this perspective, intelligence is not switched on when a brain appears. It emerges gradually as systems accumulate layers of interaction and feedback. This view also helps explain why intelligence appears in so many forms. Bacteria navigate chemical gradients. Immune systems learn from exposure. Ant colonies allocate labor. Brains generate thought. Forests regulate ecosystems. Each operates at a different scale, through different mechanisms, but all exhibit adaptive behavior shaped by interaction. None of these systems need to understand what they're doing. They only need to respond in ways that improve persistence. Seeing intelligence as process rather than property also removes the need for exceptionalism. Human intelligence becomes one expression of a broader phenomenon rather than an anomaly. Brains are extraordinary structures, but they are still systems embedded in networks, shaped by feedback, constrained by energy, and subject to physical limits. This continuity does not diminish human thought. It contextualizes it. Reasoning, imagination, and self-awareness become specialized outcomes of a system that has reached a particular level of complexity, not the definition of intelligence itself. Forests, then, are not failed minds. They are successful systems. They achieve stability without planning. They adapt without foresight. They coordinate without command. These outcomes do not require thought. They require organization. This reframing also clarifies why intelligence-like behavior disappears when networks break. When connections are severed, when feedback weakens, when diversity collapses, the process that produced adaptive behavior falters. Intelligence does not leave because a mind has been damaged. It leaves because the process can no longer operate. That insight is powerful because it generalizes. It applies to ecosystems, societies, and technologies alike. Whenever intelligence is treated as a property rather than a process, fragility follows. Whenever it is treated as something that emerges from interaction, resilience becomes possible. Gentle humor sometimes helps here, because the alternative sounds almost disappointing at first. There is something appealing about the idea of wise forests quietly thinking beneath our feet. The reality is less romantic, but far more interesting. Forests do not think, and yet they do something that thinking systems often struggle with. They persist. This persistence is not passive. It is active regulation, constant adjustment, continuous response. A forest is never finished. It is always becoming. Once intelligence is understood this way, the original question loses its sting. The forest does not need a mind to behave intelligently, because intelligence was never a thing it needed to possess. It is something the system does when conditions allow. This understanding also dissolves the urge to either mystify or dismiss forest behavior. There is no need to attribute consciousness where none exists. There is also no need to reduce everything to blind mechanism devoid of significance. Between those extremes lies organization. Organization is enough. It produces outcomes that matter. It creates stability. It supports life. It adapts over time. It gives rise to patterns that feel meaningful because they work. In this sense, forests do not force a redefinition of intelligence. They reveal one that was already there, hidden behind human-centered assumptions. Intelligence is not about having thoughts. It is about what happens when many parts interact under constraint. It is about response rather than reflection, about regulation rather than reasoning, about persistence rather than awareness. Once that shift settles in, intelligence stops looking rare. It stops belonging only to creatures that resemble us. It becomes a feature of the living world wherever interaction, feedback, and adaptation are allowed to accumulate. Forests simply make this visible. They move slowly. They operate quietly. Their processes unfold over decades rather than seconds. That slowness strips away the drama of thought and leaves the structure underneath exposed. What remains is not a thinking forest but an organized one. And that distinction changes everything. It allows intelligence to be seen not as a badge of superiority, but as a natural outcome of complexity. Not as a possession, but as a process. Not as something that appears suddenly, but as something that emerges gradually wherever systems are allowed to interact long enough. With that understanding in place, the forest no longer needs defending against misunderstanding. It does not need to be made more human to be impressive. It is impressive precisely because it is not. And once intelligence is seen this way, the final step is gentle rather than dramatic. The question is no longer whether forests think. It is whether thinking was ever the right standard to begin with. The question that has quietly followed everything so far can now be returned to without urgency. If forests do not think, and if they have no awareness, no intention, and no inner experience at all, why does their behavior so often look intelligent? The simplest answer is also the most careful one. Forests behave intelligently because intelligence, at its most basic level, is not the same thing as thought. What forests show is not intelligence as feeling or reflection, but intelligence as outcome. The ability to persist under changing conditions, the capacity to respond proportionally to stress, the tendency to organize resources in ways that maintain function over time. None of this requires awareness. It requires structure, interaction, and feedback. This distinction matters because it resolves the puzzle without dissolving the wonder. Once intelligence is separated from thinking, the forest no longer appears contradictory. It does not need a hidden mind to coordinate its responses. It only needs connections that allow local actions to influence wider patterns. Roots respond to moisture. Fungi redistribute nutrients. Chemical signals alter behavior. Feedback loops regulate extremes. Diversity spreads risk. Over time, these interactions accumulate into behavior that works. Nothing in this picture is speculative. Each mechanism has been measured, tested, and observed. And yet, when they operate together, the result still feels more than mechanical. That feeling does not come from mystery alone. It comes from scale. Forests operate on timescales that stretch human intuition. Responses unfold over seasons and decades. Adjustments accumulate gradually. Patterns emerge slowly enough to feel intentional, even when they're not. The slowness gives space for coherence to form. This coherence is easy to misinterpret. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. When behavior appears coordinated, intention is often assumed. But coordination can arise without any part of the system knowing what the others are doing. It only requires that responses feed back into one another reliably. Seen this way, forests do not challenge science. They illustrate it. They show what happens when energy flows through a system with enough components, enough variation, and enough time for feedback to shape outcomes. The intelligence is not hidden. It is distributed. Importantly, explaining this does not reduce significance. There is a temptation to think that removing thought removes meaning, that without awareness, behavior becomes trivial. The opposite is true. Understanding how forests function without minds highlights just how powerful organization can be. Without planning, forests regulate water, carbon, nutrients, and temperature across entire landscapes. Without intention, they recover from disturbance. Without awareness, they adapt. This is not less impressive than thought-based intelligence. It is impressive in a different way. Human intelligence is flexible and fast, but also fragile. It relies on energy-intensive tissue, constant maintenance, and narrow conditions. Forest intelligence, if it can be called that, is slow and robust. It tolerates loss. It absorbs shock. It persists. Neither form replaces the other. They exist on the same continuum. This perspective also grounds expectations. Forests do not act wisely. They do not protect everything. They do not aim for harmony. They persist where conditions allow and reorganize when they do not. Collapse is possible. Failure is part of the process. That honesty is important. It prevents disappointment and avoids romanticizing natural systems beyond recognition. Appreciating forests does not require believing they are benevolent or conscious. It requires recognizing that they are organized. Organization is enough to produce behavior that feels meaningful. The mystery, then, is not why forests behave intelligently without thinking. The mystery is how often humans overlook intelligence that does not resemble their own. Thought has become the default standard, when it's only one expression of a broader phenomenon. By stepping back from that standard, intelligence becomes easier to see elsewhere, in immune systems that learn without awareness, in ecosystems that regulate without command, in networks that adapt without planning. Forests become one example among many, but also a particularly clear one. Their processes are large enough to observe, their timescales are slow enough to trace, their components are tangible. What happens beneath the forest floor is not abstract. It is physical, chemical, and measurable. And yet, when taken together, it produces behavior that feels greater than its parts. That feeling does not need to be explained away. It can be acknowledged as a response to complexity. Humans respond emotionally to systems that hold together under pressure. Stability feels meaningful. Persistence feels purposeful. These reactions say as much about human perception as they do about forests. Understanding the mechanisms beneath does not flatten that response. It sharpens it. A forest that behaves intelligently without thinking does not lose its depth. It gains it. Each response is no longer magical, but it is also no longer accidental. It is the outcome of countless interactions shaped by constraint and time. This framing also invites calm rather than awe. There is no need to elevate forests into something unknowable. They do not hide secrets behind consciousness. Their behavior is open to study, and that openness is reassuring. The forest does not need to be mystified to be respected. Respect can come from understanding how much coordination is required for stability, how fragile that coordination can be, and how easily it can be disrupted. Knowing how forests function makes their loss more tangible, not less. At the same time, understanding avoids despair. Forests have persisted through immense change because organization gives them options. That resilience is not infinite, but it is real. Leaving this question resolved but not closed is appropriate. Forests do not think. That fact stands. And yet, they behave in ways that are adaptive, coherent, and effective. There is no contradiction there. Intelligent behavior does not require thought. It requires interaction that works. Forests show what that looks like when it unfolds slowly, quietly, and across scales too large for any single organism to grasp. They are not thinking systems, they are functioning ones, and recognizing the difference does not diminish them. It brings them into focus. With that clarity, the question no longer demands an answer so much as a perspective. Forests behave intelligently, not because they have something extra, but because they are allowed to operate as systems. Understanding that is not an ending. It is a way of seeing that remains open. The question that first opened this exploration can now be approached one last time, without tension or urgency. If forests do not think, if they have no awareness, no intention, and no inner experience at all, why do they behave in ways that look so intelligent? By now, the answer no longer feels paradoxical. Intelligent behavior does not require thinking. It does not require awareness. It does not require intention. What it requires is organization that works. Forests behave intelligently because they are structured in ways that allow local responses to accumulate into coherent outcomes. Roots respond to moisture and nutrients. Fungi redistribute resources. Chemical signals alter behavior. Feedback loops regulate extremes. Diversity spreads risk. Over time, these processes stabilize one another. The forest persists, adapts, and recovers, not because it knows what it is doing, but because the way it is organized allows effective behavior to emerge. This reframing matters because it shifts intelligence away from minds and toward processes. Intelligence becomes something systems do rather than something entities possess. It is no longer locked inside brains. It appears wherever interaction, feedback, and constraint are allowed to shape behavior over time. Seen this way, the forest does not imitate intelligence, it exemplifies it. This does not flatten the forest into machinery or strip it of significance. Understanding how something works does not make it smaller, it makes it more precise. The quiet beauty of a forest does not vanish when its mechanisms are revealed. If anything, it deepens. Knowing that stability arises without oversight, that coordination emerges without command, and that resilience forms without planning adds weight. rather than removing it. There is a tendency to believe that meaning requires mystery and that explanation drains wonder. But forests suggest the opposite. Their significance does not depend on being unknowable. It depends on being coherent. The fact that order can arise naturally, persist quietly, and adapt without guidance is not less meaningful because it can be explained. It is meaningful because it works. Forests also remind us that design is not the only path to order. They are not built toward a goal. They are not optimized by foresight. They are shaped by constraints, filtered by persistence, and held together by interaction. What endures is not what is planned, but what remains viable. This perspective carries a gentle reassurance. It suggests that coherence does not require control. Stability does not require supervision. Systems can regulate themselves when their structure allows it. That lesson is not dramatic, but it is grounding. It also invites humility. Human intelligence often moves quickly, forcefully, and with intention. Forest intelligence, if it can be called that, moves slowly, indirectly, and without awareness. Both are forms of organization responding to constraint. Neither is complete on its own. Neither stands outside nature. The forest does not outperform thought. It complements it. It shows what intelligence looks like when time is abundant and speed is unnecessary. It shows what adaptation looks like when it is distributed rather than centralized. Importantly, this understanding does not close the door on mystery. Complex systems do not collapse neatly into simple explanations. Even when mechanisms are known, outcomes remain difficult to predict. Small changes can produce large effects. Interactions can amplify or cancel one another. History matters. Context matters. The mystery that remains is not a failure of science. It is a property of complexity. Systems made of many interacting parts cannot be reduced to single causes without losing what makes them systems at all. Forests retain this complexity. They are not puzzles waiting to be solved once and for all. They are processes unfolding continuously. What is understood today does not exhaust what can be learned tomorrow. New disturbances, new conditions, and new interactions will always reveal new behavior. This is not an invitation to mysticism. It is an acknowledgement of scale. The forest teaches that understanding and uncertainty can coexist. Knowing how something works does not mean knowing everything it will ever do. Explanation provides clarity, not closure. There is also a quiet comfort in this view. Forests have persisted through immense change not because they are invulnerable, but because organization gives them options. They bend, reorganize, and sometimes fail. Persistence is not guaranteed, but it is earned through structure rather than intention. This shifts attention away from heroic narratives of survival and toward quieter ones of adjustment. The forest does not conquer its environment. It fits within it, reshaping itself as conditions demand. That is not drama. It is continuity. Returning to the original question now feels different. If forests cannot think, why do they behave intelligently? Because intelligence was never confined to thinking in the first place. Thought is one expression of adaptive organization, not its definition. Forests remind us that intelligence can be slow, distributed, and silent. It can unfold without awareness and still produce outcomes that matter. It can exist without being possessed. It can arise without being designed. This understanding does not elevate forests above other systems, and it does not diminish them either. It places them where they belong, as one clear expression of how order emerges in the living world. What the forest teaches about intelligence is not that minds are unimportant, but that they are not the only way coherence appears. Interaction, feedback, and structure are enough to produce behavior that works. That lesson does not demand awe, it invites steadiness. Coherence can arise naturally, stability can persist quietly, organization can endure without guidance. The forest does not think, and yet it continues. Understanding why does not end the story. It simply allows it to be seen clearly, without projection and without exaggeration. That clarity is not an ending, or it is a place to rest.